Yeah, live on Facebook.
Oh yeah, we're live.
Yeah,
Okay,
now we are.
good afternoon. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. Um, you're listening to Resonance 104.4 FM, also live, hopefully, on Facebook and later on YouTube, all under the title It's Good to Talk. And this is the third of It's Good to Talk group show hosted by myself, Donald Hyslop, and Nicole van Dijk. And as ever, we have two guests with us this afternoon who we'll introduce in a moment for an hour of discussion around the themes of creativity, community, and culture. We've been trying to explore over the last few weeks with colleagues from all over the world different aspects of what that means to work in a creative and cultural fields, how people come to that, what motivates them, and how they work and articulate their work with different sorts of communities. So that's what we want to explore through these programs. I think it's not particularly about COVID. It didn't start with that. It started about talking about creativity, but you can't sort of avoid it. The very fact that we're doing this over Zoom and not live in the residence studio as we normally do is a different way of communicating, which we're all getting used to doing more of the time. And that affects our work, as does the whole thing. So of course, we'll touch on that and talk about that as we go on, but very much around what it is to be creative and how it works and how it's social relevance. So I'll introduce Nicole in a minute, and she can introduce Carlos. For you, those of you who want to know a bit more about me, I've worked in culture and museums and food and markets for a long time. I'm head of community partnerships at Tate Modern and chair of culture and creative skills agency in Britain. This is very much about a personal lens, a personal perspective from the people in these conversations, but all of us have connections to institutions as well. But I'm really delighted to welcome as our first guest Bob and Roberta Smith, the contemporary British artist, writer, author, musician, art education advocate, and campaigner. And you will be able to see from the Zoom evidence of all of that enshrined behind him in his work. And I've worked with Bob over the years on projects, and also he presents his own very innovative show on Arts Radio Resonance. So welcome, Bob, and we'll come to you in a moment. Good to see you.
Very nice to be here.
Nicole.
Yes, hi. Thank you, Donald. Donald and I, we initiated this meeting we have today, this talk. I am a curator in a museum in Rotterdam, a program leader of participation, research and participation, and I set up an active collection in the city. Well, I met Carlos, who is here with us today, in South Africa, where he asked me to function as a trainer for a program for museum professionals from Africa, which was a great week we had there. But for you, it is one of the trainings you do, because it's your work to lead the training programs for ICOM, the International Council of Museums. And before that, Carlos, you had quite a lot of experience in all kinds of fields of museums, heritage and culture. And before that, you lived in Colombia. And I was so curious, Carlos, if you could tell us a bit about growing up in Colombia, as it is for us quite a different world, of course. So could you tell a bit on that?
Okay, well, first, thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Donald, and nice to meet you, Bob. Well, if we start talking about growing up in Colombia, yeah, well, I can say that it's a very good experience. I grew up in the 80s. It was a very particular moment in the history of my country. There were a lot of violence and a lot of sorry to start with this sad part, but yeah, I mean, I have not been a victim, a direct victim of the conflict, but in a way, there are many things that now that we see them in perspective, they are a little bit shocking of how we grew up. But it was we always find the time to be happy and to celebrate life, and there were areas that were more touched by the conflict, like right now it's still happening. Fortunately, I grew up in a city that it was not very affected by the conflict. It was affected, but not that much. But yeah, it was my home city is Bucaramanga. There I studied communication as a bachelor degree. And then I moved to Bogota to work for a museum for the first time at the National Museum of Colombia.
Mm-hmm. So, and then you decided to work more internationally. So if I read it well, you started working for UNESCO, I believe.
Yeah, well, I worked for a while at the National Museum in Colombia as assistant curator of archaeology. It's kind of weird because I'm a communication professional, but at that moment they wanted someone to communicate with the audience. So that's why I was working for this curatorship of archaeology. But then I moved to Berlin, to Berlin and Cottbus to study World Heritage. And then while I was doing this master degree, I moved to Paris for an internship at UNESCO. And there I was working for 2 years, then as consultant for the Europe and North America unit of the World Heritage Center. And then I moved back to Colombia, and I was...
Carlos, when you were...
Sorry?
When you were... Sorry, it's the feed's not so great today. I don't know if it's just... But when you were growing up in Colombia, what were the sort of... and that was a difficult time, as you say. What were the sort of creative influences you had then? Was it music, sport, archaeology? Because obviously there's a huge history in Colombia.
When I was a teenager, I was very, very close to the theater sector. I was part of several theater groups when I was in high school, at the university. There were artists in my family. Beatriz Gonzalez, it's a very well-known Colombian artist. She's part of my family, so she also, knowing that she was part of the family, she also influenced me. And then I was working very close while I was at the university with the Modern Art Museum at Bucaramanga. And it was a big influence for my career to decide to work for museums as professional.
And Bob, what about you?
Oh, sorry.
Bob, what about a bit about your background and where you came from and sort of early influences, things like that?
Well, part of my thing is that I come from a very kind of arty family. The thing that's one of the things that's always interested me. My parents were very, very, very working class. They sold vegetables in North End Road Market, and my grandfather was a plumber. So they were the ones that picked up a pencil and a paintbrush for the first time, not me. And that's always really interested me. And so we had art everywhere when I was a child. And my dad ended up during the 60s, when the year that I was born, he was made the director of Chelsea School of Art on Manresa Road, and it was a a grand modernist building, where floors were devoted to the activities of art. So this idea that art is somehow on the periphery of one's life, or it was how our family earned its money. So there's that idea, but running alongside that was the idea is that they were engaged in a sort of post-war boom, but they were liberal left-wing people. So we all went to the local comprehensive school, and there everyone was there. In that period, the working classes, the middle classes, and some quite posh kids were at this comprehensive school. But then when I went to art school, they weren't there. The population of the population of the comprehensive school, the social diversity of the comprehensive school, was not at art school. At university, when I went to university, there were no black students studying art, and then emerging into the art. And then I went and often did lots of different things. Lived in America and Rome, but it's that relationship that has really angered me, actually, and has led me to try and bring ideas about art education into the museum, to show that disparity, really. And then as things have gone on, it began with doing workshops which were a bit like gardens, where anybody could come in and make things, exhibiting the materials rather than the art. But then as time went on, of course, as museums became more sophisticated in ideas about outreach, these programs became, outside of the museum, but also inside. So it's been that sort of journey. I mean, that's been my interest in it, really, up until now.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, because Carlos, also you are trying with the work you do to bring more diversity in the museums, but from another angle. Can you tell a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I cannot deny my background and my previous experience. Where I was at the National Museum of Colombia, we developed a very interesting program about diversity and about inclusion. We're working a lot with visual and hearing impaired communities, and also we call them communities in situation of vulnerability.
Mm-hmm.
And it was the most interesting part of this project is that we worked with them, not for them. Mm-hmm. Of course, it was a process, and this is what I try to develop in all our trainings: the importance of not waiting until everything is ready to be able to launch a program. Yeah. We had a very interesting experience with a hearing impaired student called Daniela. She came to us asking to be part of our volunteers program, and we were not prepared to do that. So we had a lot of discussions inside the museum, and then we say, okay, we will never be ready if we don't decide to be ready and to work for that. So we had a very honest discussion with her, and we said, okay, we are not ready, but your role will be to make us ready. And then that's how it started. It was difficult at the beginning, but we had a very clear, honest conversation with her all the time. And then the result was very good. So the next year we had another hearing impaired and 2 visual impaired students. So that's how we grow. In the trainings that I tried to develop, I tried to push a little bit this community engagement processes. There are many examples that I have found. I think in Latin America and in Africa, this is a very important topic, inclusion and community engagement. And in some countries in Europe, like UK and the Netherlands, I think they are leading these community engagement processes. And of course, we have other type of initiatives. But that's it. I think the important is to encourage museums to start a dialogue with these communities.
Yeah. Yeah, and what I saw, how you were trying to support the group in South Africa when I was there. What you actually did was pushing people to get ready a little bit. You were pushing gently, you know, so like, yes, you are ready, you can do it. So that was really nice.
I didn't notice, but that's good.
Yeah. Yeah, that was quite hard work for you as well.
Yeah. I think people have fear all the time, and
Yeah.
it's understandable because it's a huge responsibility. It doesn't mean that we just jump without knowing what we are going to do, but we need to overcome this fear and try to do things with the communities and to talk to them and ask them what do they need, and then you will find answers.
Yeah.
That's been part of your, Bob, part of your practice, I suppose, as you just said, is about, in a different way, how do you re-engage people with art and contemporary culture who wouldn't normally, you know, people at school who never made the pathway. A lot of your work has been to try and make art or the practice or the process more inclusive, whether that's through teaching or some of your projects, do you think?
Well, I think there's lots of there's a few things going on. One is that, you know, I teach in an art school now. I'm an associate professor at London Metropolitan University, which is one of those, that's really where if you like, any kind of work of mine in this area is really active and on the kind of front lines, unfortunate term, but you know, that's where that happens, because London Met is under the Blair years, it was known as a, you know, they had a ethos that it would be a widening participation university. It was part of the old Polytechnic scheme. It wasn't part of the hierarchy of universities. So there's this, so it had, in some years we have you know, a very diverse population. In other years we don't. It's very noticeable since fees have gone up that an interesting thing that has happened is that the population has become more diverse. It's strange, but it's become more diverse because we, as gatekeepers, people like me, white men, we don't have the power anymore. We just need the students. And if the students are mad enough to want to study fine art, they can come. We let them in. Whereas in the past, we didn't. We chose people who were like us. And that's one. I see that dynamic in universities. I see it in museums, unfortunately. But it's the culture of the people running the museums and in the museums. It's the old feminist thing, you know. They're in position, perhaps, but perhaps not in positions of power. And so it's you know, you'll go to a museum now, you'll see a very diverse population, but they'll largely be security guards and people looking after the paintings rather than people hanging the paintings on the wall. So there's so many different things. It's culture. It's not just diversity, it's also class. I mean, artists are terrible for being these kind of shamans who want to tell people how to live their lives. Well, that's a wealthy position's angle on the world. Actually, to open doors, you need to realize that somehow the people that surround the museums have, I mean, certainly in the East End, they have a lot more culture than the white people who go home and listen to the Archers or listen to, you know, might go to the opera or something. You know, they have amazing and rich and diverse and vibrant cultures. And it's somehow it seems to me somehow getting those relationships really lively and interesting. You know, it's more of a, it's one of those problems, isn't it, for the museum or the institution to realize how actually culture is outside of the museum, and actually it can be a bit of a intellectual desert inside the museum. You know, it's quite tricky, that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think all of you, by the way, I hope neither of you got the Archers cultural reference. Hopefully that's only for Britain. It hasn't spread across it's a terribly middle-class radio program. You're all, funnily enough, all three of you, your work is very much about the outside the physical space as well, how communities and culture works in wider society. And you might argue that that is where some of the most interesting things always did happen and are still happening today. What do you think?
Are you addressing that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just chip in because you keep freezing on my screen.
Yeah. No, but Bob said something very important, is that now museums need communities. I mean, and need people to come in. That's why we are opening the doors, and there is a lot of work to do still, but we cannot continue saying that museums are important per se. I mean, if a museum is born and nobody cares, I mean, it is also our responsibility. So we need to matter. We need to make people to find a space in a museum space to express their cultures, their cultural expressions being there. So we really need to open to make this diversity come into the museum. It's difficult because it is an institution, and it's difficult to change the structures in such kind of institution. But I think it's happening.
I mean, I think one thing that is really, it's to do with the nature of visuality, is that we like the idea as human beings that we look at art and we go and witness it, and we're a kind of audience for looking at art that's been made in the past or made by other people but perhaps in our time. But I think the revolution is going to be when we realize that museums should be more actively, they have been commissioning art, of course, but more actively facilitators, makers of culture. I mean, I've been saying that all schools should be art schools. I think all museums should in some way be art schools, take on that aspect of making, commissioning, facilitating the culture of now and the culture of the people who are around the museum, as much as, bringing into, I mean, the Arts Council in Britain was built on the idea of bringing great art to the people. Well, you couldn't run that statement now. I mean, I hope you couldn't run that statement now. It should be really about the museum as a kind of engine, a publisher, a facilitator, a disseminator of the culture, I think.
Yes, I agree with you totally. I think as well as Donald just said, that a lot of the culture is happening, or all the culture is happening outside the museum, and we are just trying to understand and communicate with the audience what it means. What all this culture means around it, and how we can find each other in this process of giving meaning on daily life of us. So yeah, museums are very much about the world around us, but so we still have to find a way how to make this also interesting and appealing in exhibitions and in the work of museums. So the question is also, is a museum still an exhibition, or is it something else in the future?
I think it should become, I think it has to become something else, because well, to do with democracy, to do with culture, but also to do with this. I mean, it's one of the awful things about the politics in Britain at the moment, but this idea of the expert or the intellectual being slightly demonized, that is that we think that's a dreadful thing, but actually there's some truth in that. And that there is some truth in the sense that the people who've been running culture and running politics in Britain have been out of touch with people's voices, and actually now is the time to seize the agenda. If you're somebody of the liberal left, now is the time to go, Well, okay, that is a wake-up call. We have to say your culture is our culture. We're not trying to pull one over on the people. You know, we want to say, look, everybody's voice is valuable. You know, everybody's accent and nuance adds something to the rich, life that we live. You know.
Yeah, I think that, and I think it's not that you shouldn't value being an expert or scholarly or academic endeavor. It's about how you position and articulate that. And I think Carlos mentioned it. It's about having the dialogue and having the active participation of people in how you form ideas. It doesn't remove the need for a curator or an expert.
Yeah.
And also I think economically and environmentally, the blockbusters may be a thing of the past, are definitely suspended for the next few years, whether that's in an art exhibition or antiquity or heritage and everything. So more and more these dialogues you're all talking about, and how we actively empower people in the process of the organizations as well as the culture is going to be absolutely paramount.
That's right.
But it's still a sort of battleground of ideas still, I think.
Yeah, I think it is not that we will deny what we have done for many years. I think exhibitions are important, scholars are important, but this to be able to question ourselves and then to transform ourselves and our dynamics. Because as Bob says, I mean, the dynamics in cultural sector are quite particular, and especially in each country has its particularities in the cultural sector, but we need to transform ourselves and to open ourselves and to be humble enough to say, okay, it is not only what I think as an expert, but also what is happening outside, as you already said.
I think there's this is just maybe irrelevant, but it maybe also be a plug for a charity that I'm on the trustees, one of the trustees for. But Art UK have done an interesting thing today. They're an online resource which has all the art in the UK on their site. It needs to become Art World somehow, but what they've launched today is a thing where they have all the online work. It's a very simple idea, but now anybody from today can curate their own exhibition. So you can create these timelines and stories of your own interest in art. And I was trying to curate a timeline of all the artists that I knew about in the early 80s, but whose careers disappeared. And they were actually collected by and I had all sorts of people. You know, I had this wonderful painter called Claudette Johnson, and a guy called Denzel Forrester, who's been rethought about now a little bit. Shows for Stephen Freeman Gallery, but lots of Black and Asian artists who, at one moment, they had a like all art careers. People get there's a bit of excitement when people first emerge, but then it's hard to sustain that. And I think with an art world that's only interested in a particular kind of art, and then the YBAs happened and all of that. But I think that idea of a kind of online curate button, suddenly that changes everything, because then anybody, can be a curator, and actually it's very exciting. Then you're going to get other stories rather than the institution stories. I think that is interesting. When suddenly somebody else goes. I mean, I love what you're doing. This idea of the museum that's outside of the walls of the museum. I love that idea, Nicole, that you're doing that. But I suppose with this, it's like sort of, and I think there's that idea of the idea of involving people in to say what's important, to tell their story of the artworks that they're interested in, because there's not one story.
I think Nicole, 2 weeks ago, Marlene from Athens, they were doing a very similar initiative, weren't they, where they were asking people to curate their own things with personal perspectives on the National Museum there. Is that right?
Yeah, it's called the museum inside me, but it was more like putting up objects from their own homes
no.
as a museum piece with a story around it.
But that's a great title, isn't it? The Museum in Me, because we are all,
Yeah.
you know, we're all self-curated
Yeah.
museums of our own ideas, aren't we?
Yeah,
You know?
yeah,
I
definitely.
am. You know, that record that I listened to, that book that I read, you know, we're all our own curations, aren't we?
Yeah, yeah,
That's a lovely
definitely.
idea.
Yeah. I was wondering, Carlos, because you meet so many people involved in culture around the world, do you also meet new ideas about participation or turning the museum inside out? And could you share some with us?
Well, that's a very difficult question to choose experiences, but I think most of them, I mean, there are some regions where scholars are more open to do this kind of things, and other academic systems that are more strict. So I think the most successful experiences are where the scholars or the people who are already working in museums, they are able to do that, to put themselves in a equal to equal position with the communities and work with them. I mean, it's very interesting when you, for example, there are experiences that you take the museum outside and then as a first experience to connect to the people, and then you bring the people to the museum. Mm-hmm. So it's not just bringing people inside, but if you haven't changed any dynamic, people will reject this idea of a museum. So you need first to go there and then go inside and bring them inside the museum and work with them. So I think that the most important thing I have learned, I mean, we are not that different, but the way we are able to put ourselves in a position of dialogue with the communities, this is what it marks the successful or not, the success or not of an experience or an initiative of community engagement.
But Carlos, do you think, of course, in the global south, there has always been a tradition of museums and cultural venues, but in a lot of places, the infrastructure is maybe not so good. I mean, in Africa and other places with digital, a lot of societies have gone from straight to mobile devices and mobile technology because there wasn't a huge telephone infrastructure, for instance. Mm-hmm. But do you think the sort of northern model of creating these huge architectural museums and galleries and all of that, is that actually the way forward for even now, you know, for places like the global south? Is that just an orthodox? Isn't there maybe a different way of a more diffuse way of doing culture and cultural provision in the developing world? But
yeah. I think there are two different ways to approach this, because for example, I think a small and middle-sized museum, they have a huge potential to work with communities. And one might think that, okay, if this is the trend, I mean, maybe we won't have so many big museums anymore. But big museums is becoming also a trend in Africa and in Latin America, in the Arab region, because sometimes we want to have these big museums to bring people in, because it's also, we need to accept that museums are linked to tourism. Also as a political statement, as an economic productivity statement, also to say like, okay, we look what we are doing now. There are some countries, developed countries, who are encouraging this and supporting this, the construction of these museums. So I cannot say that this is the way forward, but it's also happening. So we will always have this, and none of them are bad per se. I mean, I think we can both work together. It's like in Europe. In Europe, we have these big museums that are that are also working with communities, other that are very traditional and more conservative, but we also have a huge amount of small and middle-sized museums that are doing a great job. So I think these are like two different paths that museums are now working on.
Mm.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts about that, Rob?
Well, I had a thought about it. I mean, I don't have a lot of experience about working in those kind of areas. I've worked. I did a project with Pa Joe, the African coffin maker, in Ghana a few years ago, and it struck me that that when I was there, that he has his own museum, you know, which is his workshop, and people are and actually it's interesting what you were saying about connecting to things directly via digital, because we were trying to say to him, you know, you got to do Facebook and Instagram and stuff like this to get your, you know, get your mojo going again. He had a bit of a slump when I did this project with him, and my God, it's really worked for him. It's really getting stuff out there. But it also reminds me a little bit of a conversation that I had with Yinka Shonabari last week, which was on Resonance FM, which you can tune in and listen to if you want. But he was talking about Fela Kuti. So when he was growing up in Lagos, his mum and dad, you know, from quite a strict family, they wouldn't let him go near Fela Kuti's shrine in Lagos. But Fela Kuti, you know, he had this amazing, you know, I don't know what it was. Maybe it was a museum, maybe it was a venue, maybe it was like a semi-religious shrine, maybe it was a kind of state capital. But he had his own, he had his own kind of museum to himself. And I think that's something like that. There's something quite compelling about this idea of the small museum, the museum of me, the museum of, you know, the local person who's making their stuff. I just think that's a compelling idea. I don't know quite how to manifest it. I mean, for instance, like in the 80s, I traveled a lot across the southern states of the United States. Well, there you have all of these amazing folk artists, you know, and you just go from somebody's. In fact, the Turner Contemporary did an exhibition about them recently. This idea of the backyard. So the backyard is your museum, and you just go from these different artists making these extraordinary folk art works. And the idea is somebody driving around from New York is that you're driving around you're keeping them going. You're buying their stuff, you know, and you're traveling from one backyard to the next, if you like. But so it's not a conventional idea of a museum, but you know, somehow the idea of whether it's a museum or a backyard or a Fela Kuti shrine or you know, a site where art is made, artist studio, you know, it's that sort of, maybe there's some kind of model there that will grow and develop, you know.
You're doing
so
that.
Yeah, it's
You do
sort
that
of,
in
you know,
Rotterdam, Nicole. That's exactly what you do.
Yeah, well, what I recognize very much about what you're saying, and also about what Carlos is saying, that there's more hybrid places where different forms of culture are sort of coming and merging together, makes it also with a lower threshold for people to join. Yeah, that's also what I try to do in Rotterdam, is set up a sort of heritage collection in districts of the city, where people in a certain district are talking with each other, are valuing their culture, and then at a certain moment are coming out to the city museum and sort of show their heritage over there. It is a sort of more hybrid way of dealing with culture, which I think is a sort of way forward. Also to have more people participated.
Well, I think that's you see, that's great. I mean, I think in London, the reason why London was so exciting in the 1990s is because there was a lot of you know, cheap real estate that artists could get hold of, and me and lots of artists, we organised shows in those spaces, and in a way they were like a kind of our version of that, I suppose, in a way. But maybe it's a bit like the idea of the music venue, the music venues. The private gallery, the private gallery is always pitching to something somewhere else, isn't it? It's trying to get some collectors to come along and buy some work or something. But maybe it's like the music venue where you're putting things on not a huge scale, but you're putting things on that are interesting, that people love, and it doesn't matter that it's a highfalutin biennale, triennale kind of program, it's a program of things that people love and things that mean things to people.
I think.
And I agree with Nicole when she said about she talks about these hybrid spaces, because that's the idea, is that with the technology is giving us a lot of tools, but it doesn't mean that we will go only to this kind of activities. But we also have exhibition from big artists, or about historical times, historical places or issues. But also we have the space where people can express themselves, and we need to create links and to make people talk in the museum, because recently with this this situation of COVID-19, people are saying like, because now the future is the technology, everybody can create an exhibition online, but there is this human contact that is also important in museums, and we cannot forget that. I mean, we can have an exchange, a digital exchange is not bad, it's very good, it gives a lot of opportunities of access to our collections and to our heritage, but this is not only what museum does. I mean, a museum is not only an exhibition, but it also the links and the relationships that you create when you visit a museum, even if you visit it in a group or individually, but you create links with your own heritage and with the heritage that it's presented there, and it's a space for exchanges.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, the technology is only how humans shape it. It's benign in that way still. So it's how it's shaped and there's been a lot of people have bombarded people with digital content in the cultural sector with very good motives, but it needs to be much more participatory and guided. I just wanted to ask you a bit, all of you actually, but the two of you, it's political what you do, there's no question. ICOM is involved in politics and soft power, and there's been a big debate about the definition of a museum and over the last year, and that's still very much a battleground between the traditionalists and some of the things we're talking about. Bob, you've also articulated what you're doing into politics. You had a party in the election, the art party, and you've used it in sort of overt politics as well. Given the situation we're in and going forward, where there's obviously going to be a lot of economic pressure and competition for money and all the things we talked about the value of culture and everything, we do have to be a bit political about it as well. And how do you think, what is the sort of strategies we need to be adopting for this stuff we're talking about, which is important to be current and relevant in the period we're going into for the next few years? Sorry, very long-winded question.
I think there is I know it's a bit mad to say this, but I think there is a sort of an amazing opportunity afforded by COVID-19, which is that you've got a lot of people are not sitting around doing nothing. A lot of people are working in frightening conditions on the front line, collecting your bins, delivering your milk, and working in the hospitals. But there are a lot of people who are interested in museums, are sitting around doing nothing at the moment, and who are the audiences for museums. Lots of middle class, people who would love to go to a museum the minute they open again. But what my effort during this time has been to say, look, make something. I mean, it's very simple. It's just make something. You'll realize that it's not necessarily something that only artists can do, making art. Anybody can make art. And that's been my effort, because I think that's about, I think making art, at primary school, if you like, it is about kids finding their voices and making their marks and finding themselves, and about constructing who they're going to be later on as adults. And I just think we need to somehow get adults to realize that making art is not just for kids. Somehow it's for them. They've got to do it. And so this activity, this kind of, not just looking, but making, participating, constructing art. So what I'm hoping is that when the lockdown finally ends globally, a load of people will walk into the museum and go, I want a show here. I want to put my stuff up on the walls. That's what I want to happen. And there'll be people with different voices, with different stories to tell. That's what I want to happen during this time. So that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to tell people, just do it, make it, do it, make art. And then when they come out, they'll put pressure on the museums to tell some other stories other than the stories we all know.
Yeah, well, it's quite beautiful what you say, that when children are in primary school, that they are finding their voice by making art or drawing, or
singing. I mean, that's literally finding your voice, isn't it? Learning to sing is finding your voice.
Yeah. Well, it would be beautiful if people would use this time to discover their new voice.
I'm slightly utopian, but that's my effort. So every day I'm posting things on Instagram saying, look, make art with shadows, or today it was make art with brooms. Just make art. You can do it. Anybody can do it. Don't need to be Anthony Gormley to do it. It's simple. Just do it. That's my effort anyway.
For museums, I think we always say that we need to answer to our community's needs and expectations, and I think this is the moment to ask people and to ask our communities what do they need, because I think museums right now, they have a huge opportunity and a huge responsibility to work with those people who have been severely impacted by the situation. In some countries more than others, but there are these communities that has been very impacted. Even artists has been severely impacted by this situation, but also community around the museum. So I think we need to start creating programs for that. I mean, from a point of view of this is a responsibility, but also an opportunity, because there will be a lot of funds for these kind of projects to recover our countries, our economies, our communities, to make them realize that they can create, or that they can stay together after this situation, that there are spaces where they can express themselves. So I think this is at the same time a responsibility, almost a task, but also a huge opportunity for museums.
Yeah. And
I think going back.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go.
Yeah. Well, do you also see some examples already from museums moving that direction?
I was going to say, Carlos, going back to what we were talking about before, I think in Medellin in Colombia, there's some great examples of that, of what Nicole's talking about. For instance, when they put the escalators to reduce the times from the favelas on the mountain to the city, in between, they put libraries, which were cultural institutions that you could use as a culture, but they were also safe spaces. There were places that people could go in and get a coffee. They had a multiple use, a social requirement as well as a cultural requirement. And maybe it's those sort of things that we're going to see more of, because you do need to deal with some very basic needs that people have got around the world, as well as access to the core service.
Yeah, there are many examples in Medellin. There is also the House of Memory, They are developing very interesting projects with the communities. The Museo de Antioquia and the Museum of Antioquia, also in Medellin. For example, they develop projects with the sex workers around who are working around the institution. So this is a way to connect to museums and with those communities who has been marginalized or forgotten for many times. And at this moment, they really need institutions to support them.
Yeah.
And museums, they can help to these communities to go back and to continue living in a good way, or to improve their situation in the best case scenario.
Yeah.
Nicole, what about you? Because in Rotterdam and in a lot of the projects there, it's been about empowerment and people articulating their own voices to the museum. You see more of that?
Yes, well, I think, you know, like, well, I really love the word Ted Reader last week introduced, like platformism, offering people a platform and say, well, this is yours. You are so valuable that you have to be part of this platform. That's, well, I think one of the biggest thing a museum can do, like give that space and share it, and not only the space in the building, but the space which the museum has because of its name, because of the trust people have in a museum. So share that. That's one of the biggest things, or the first things to do. And then, yeah, we do lots of things. And for instance, what we are trying to do now is supporting the bread father, who is offering sandwiches for children who don't get sandwiches from home when they go back to school. His work will be more and more important now. We are facing more poverty in the future, probably. So this little and small projects, embracing them and giving them a platform in the museum is one thing we can do. And well, when I hear what you said, Donald, about this escalator and a safe space in the middle, which is a library, that sounds fantastic. I think. Have you seen it, Carlos?
Yes, of course. Yes, in Medellin.
Yes.
It's a library. Yeah.
Okay, and it really functions like that.
No. Sorry?
And it really functions like that, like a safe space and a...
Yeah, there are a lot of people. It became one of the cultural niche in the area. So
yeah,
it has worked, and they develop a lot of projects.
Yeah.
But I think so I agree with all of what you're saying, and I mean I'm seeing that as well. But I still think it comes back to how do we get, because in some ways, even in a place like Britain, I think it's gone back. It's become more elitist in the last few years and more out of reach in some ways. The people that didn't go to art school, Bob, when you and I were young. And so I still think the key to all of this, platforms, inclusivity, communities making and having all of that, is about how do we open that up to the people that are more, not even marginalized, just the people who don't know how to play the game. I think it's still the big question for us all.
And I think we also need to work better with other sectors, because usually we work together with education and with other cultural institutions, but we need to learn to work with like sectors that are usually what we consider themselves very different to us, like the health sector or the financial sector. I mean, how can we work together with hospitals and with other type of institutions? And because they have an audience there with specific needs, and we can work together to answer to these needs in very creative ways.
Definitely,
I agree with that. I think one of the things that happened over the last 10, 20 years is that all these institutions which once had a kind of mission which was social good, they've all become about financial sustainability and only about that. And so the problem with that, it's good obviously to have institutions which are financially sustainable, but then they don't talk to each other because they're all after the same audience. Whereas if we can realise that the museum and the university and the school are all trying to do something for the people, then in a joined up way, then we will really crack a nut, and things will work and it'll be interesting again, rather than these poor old institutions which are all going to be screwed because they haven't got the financial wherewithal to sustain themselves. So I think that's a key thing to get institutions working together, to realise that their mission is actually their community's well-being, and the people who visits them well-being, not just the bottom line.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think the financial question is usually a trap, because we say like we cannot do this because we don't have the money, and that's what I always say during some of our trainings, is that we need to find the allies to do this project. Sometimes, yeah, we have the cultural mediators or guides, but then there is this company which are already developing a training for people with AIDS, and they already have the platform to go there or to bring them here at our museums, and then we meet our needs, and we can do something for the well-being, as Bob says.
That's right.
Nicole, anything to add?
No, I think, well, this allies, it's really important. You can already see things changing with, for instance, working together with people against climate change and climate adaptation and culture. That there's happening a lot. Healthcare as well. So it is, I think, also a way of making things more hybrid. Yeah.
I think, I mean, as usual, the hours just slipped by really quickly. I think we've covered a lot of really interesting ground there, and it's quite a good way to finish in a way, because what you've illustrated is the power of and the strength of culture and creativity, but the need to have dialogue, to have partnerships with the audiences, with other organizations, with other institutions, with wider society, and that's going to be something that holds us in good stead, I think, going forward. And I think you've all said, and Bob, you particularly said, now is a chance to not go back. We shouldn't just replicate some of the more exclusive ways that the world that we work in has operated, and also the question of why do you do it like that? Why do we need to do it like that? I think really needs to be asked more and more, and you've illustrated that. So thank you ever so much for taking part in this. We had a few technical, but I think most of it was clear. So you've been listening to It's Good to Talk group show on Resonance 104.4 FM and also on resonancefm.com, and it's also available on YouTube and on Facebook, all under the name It's Good to Talk. So thank you all. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
More power to you.